Introduction Part 1 of Rob Roy. This is LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rowan. Rob Roy by Sir Walter Scott. Volume 1. For why? Because the good old rule sufficeth them. The simple plan, that they should take who have the power, and they should keep who can. Rob Roy's Grave, Wordsworth. Advertisement to the first edition. When the editor of the following volumes published, about 2 years since, the work called Antiquary, he announced that he was, for the last time, intruding upon the public in his present capacity. He might shelter himself under the plea that every anonymous writer is, like the celebrated Junius, only a phantom, and that therefore, although an apparition, of a more benign as well as much meaner description, he cannot be bound to plead to a charge of inconsistency. A better apology may be found in the imitating the confession of honest Benedict, that, when he said he would die a bachelor, he did not think he should live to be married. The best of all would be if, as has eminently happened in the case of some distinguished contemporaries, the merit of the work, in the reader's estimation, form an excuse for the author's breach of promise. Without presuming to hope that this may prove the case, it is only further necessary to mention, that his resolution, like that of Benedict, fell a sacrifice, to temptation at least, if not to stratagem. It is now about 6 months since the author, through the medium of his respectable publishers, received a parcel of papers containing the outlines of this narrative, with a permission, or rather a request, couched in highly flattering terms, that they might be given to the public, with such alterations as should be found suitable. As it may be necessary, in the present edition, 1829, to speak upon the square, the author thinks it proper to own that the communication alluded to is entirely imaginary. These were of course so numerous that, besides the suppression of names and of incidents approaching too much to reality, the work may in a great measure be said to be new written. Several anachronisms have probably crept in during the course of these changes, and the mottos for the chapters have been selected without any reference to the supposed date of the incidents. For these, of course, the editor is responsible. Some others occurred in the original materials, but they are of little consequence. In point of minute accuracy, it may be stated that the bridge over the Forth, or rather the Avon Dhu, or Black River, near the hamlet of Aberfoil, had not an existence 30 years ago. It does not, however, become the editor to be the first to point out these errors, and he takes this public opportunity to thank the unknown and nameless correspondent, to whom the reader will owe the principal share of any amusement which he may derive from the following pages. 1st of December 1871. Introduction, 1829. When the author projected this further encroachment on the patience of an indulgent public, he was at some loss for a title, a good name being very nearly of as much consequence in literature as in life. The title of Rob Roy was suggested by the late Mr. Constable, whose sagacity and experience foresaw the germ of popularity which it included. No introduction can be more appropriate to the work than some account of the singular character whose name is given to the title page, and who, through good report and bad report, has maintained a wonderful degree of importance in popular recollection. This cannot be ascribed to the distinction of his birth, which, though that of a gentleman, had in it nothing of high destination, and gave him little right to command in his clan. Neither, though he lived a busy, restless, and enterprising life, were his feats equal to those of other freebooters who have been less distinguished. He owed his fame in great measure to his residing on the very verge of the Highlands, and playing such pranks in the beginning of the 18th century as they usually ascribed to Robin Hood in the Middle Ages, and that, within 40 miles of Glasgow, a great commercial city, the seat of a learned university. Thus a character like his, blending the wild virtues, the subtle policy, and unrestrained license of an American Indian, was flourishing in Scotland during the Augustan age of Queen Anne and George I. Addison, it is probable, or Pope, would have been considerably surprised if they had known that there existed in the same island with them a personage of Rob Roy's peculiar habits and profession. It is this strong contrast betwixt the civilized and cultivated mode of life on the one side of the Highland line, and the wild and lawless adventure which were habitually undertaken and achieved by one who dwelt on the opposite side of that ideal boundary, which creates the interest attracted to his name. Hence it is that even yet, far and near, through vale and hill, are faces that attest the same, and kindle like a fire new stirred at sound of Rob Roy's name. There were several advantages which Rob Roy enjoyed for sustaining to advantage the character which he assumed. The most prominent of these was his descent from, and connection with, the clan MacGregor, so famous for their misfortunes, and the indomitable spirit with which they maintained themselves as a clan, linked and banded together in spite of the most severe laws, executed with unheard of rigour against those who bore this forbidden surname. Their history was that of several other of the original Highland clans, who were suppressed by more powerful neighbours, and either extirpated or forced to secure themselves by renouncing their own family appellation and assuming that of the conquerors. The peculiarity in the story of the MacGregors is their retaining, with such tenacity, their separate existence and union as a clan under circumstances of the utmost urgency. The history of the tribe is briefly as follows, but we must premise that the tale depends in some degree on tradition. Therefore, excepting when written documents are quoted, it must be considered as in some degree dubious. The sept of MacGregor claimed a descent from Gregor, or Gregorius, third son, it is said, of Alpine, King of Scots, who flourished about 787. Hence their original patronymic is MacAlpine, and they are usually termed the clan Alpine. An individual tribe of them retains the same name. They are accounted one of the most ancient clans in the Highlands, and it is certain they were a people of original Celtic descent, and occupied at one period very extensive possessions in Perthshire and Argyllshire, which they imprudently continued by the coir glaive, that is, the right of the sword. Their neighbours, the Earl of Argyle and Breadalbane, in the meanwhile, managed to leave the lands occupied by the MacGregors, engrossed in those charters which they easily obtained from the crown, and thus constituted a legal right in their own favour, without much regard to its justice. As opportunity occurred of annoying or extirpating their neighbours, they gradually extended their own domains, by usurping, under the pretext of such royal grants, those of their more uncivilized neighbours. A Sir Duncan Campbell of Lochow, known in the Highlands by the name of Donach Dunan Coercion, that is, Black Duncan with the cowl, it being his pleasure to wear such a headgear, is said to have been peculiarly successful in those acts of spoliation upon the clan MacGregor. The devoted sept, ever finding themselves iniquitously driven from their possessions, defended themselves by force, and occasionally gained advantage, which they used cruelly enough. This conduct, though natural, considering the country and time, was studiously represented at the capital as arising from an untamable and innate ferocity, which nothing, it was said, could remedy, save cutting off the tribe of MacGregor, root and branch. In an Act of Privy Council at Stirling, 22nd September 1563, in the reign of Queen Mary, commission is granted to the most powerful nobles and chiefs of the clans to pursue the clan Gregor with fire and sword. A similar warrant in 1563, not only grants the like powers to Sir John Campbell of Glen, the descendant of Duncan with the cowl, but discharges the lieges to receive or assist any of the clan Gregor, or afford them, under any colour whatever, meat, drink, or clothes. An atrocity which the clan Gregor committed in 1589 by the murder of John Drummond of Drummond Ernoch, a forester of the royal forest of Glenartney, is elsewhere given, with all its horrid circumstances. The clan swore upon the severed head of the murdered man that they would make common cause in avowing the deed. This led to an act of the Privy Council directing another crusade against the wicked clan Gregor, so long continuing in blood, slaughter, theft, and robbery, in which letters of fire and sword are denounced against them for the space of 3 years. The reader will find this particular fact illustrated in the introduction to the legend of Montrose, in the present edition of these novels. Other occasions frequently occurred in which the MacGregors testified contempt for the laws, from which they had often experienced severity but never protection. Though they were gradually deprived of their possessions, and of all ordinary means of procuring subsistence, they could not, nevertheless, be supposed likely to starve for famine, while they had the means of taking from strangers what they considered as rightfully their own. Hence they became versed in predatory forays and accustomed to bloodshed. Their passions were eager, and, with a little management on the part of some of their most powerful neighbours, they could easily be hounded out, to use an expressive Scottish phrase, to commit violence, of which the wily instigators took the advantage, and left the ignorant MacGregors an undivided portion of blame and punishment. This policy of pushing on the fierce clans of the Highlands and Borders to break the peace of the country is accounted by the historian one of the most dangerous practices of his own period, in which the MacGregors were considered as ready agents. Notwithstanding these severe denunciations, which were acted upon in the same spirit in which they were conceived, some of the clans still possessed property, and the chief of the name in 1592 is designed Alistair MacGregor of Glenstrae. He is said to have been a brave and active man, but, from the tenor of his confession at his death, appears to be engaged in many and desperate feuds, one of which finally proved fatal to himself and many of his followers. This was the celebrated conflict at Glen Fruin, near the south-western extremity of Loch Lomond, in the vicinity of which the MacGregors continued to exercise much authority by their coir glaive, or right of the strongest, which we have already mentioned. There had been a long and bloody feud betwixt the MacGregors and the Laird of Luss, head of the family of Colquhoun, a powerful race in the lower part of Loch Lomond. The MacGregors' tradition affirms that the quarrel began on a very trifling subject. Two of the MacGregors being benighted, asked shelter in a house belonging to a dependant of the Colquhouns, and were refused. They then retreated to an outhouse, took a wedder from the fold, killed it, and supped off the carcase, for which, it is said, they offered payment to the proprietor. The Laird of Luss seized on the offenders, and, by the summary process which feudal barons had at their command, had them both condemned and executed. The MacGregors verify this account of the feud by appealing to a proverb current amongst them, execrating the hour Malt thur an cabal gil, that the black wedder with the white tail was ever lambed. To avenge this quarrel the Laird of MacGregor assembled his clan, to the number of 300 or 400 men, and marched towards Luss from the banks of Loch Long, by a pass called Raid na Gael, or the Highlandman's Pass. Sir Humphrey Colquhoun received early notice of this incursion, and collected a strong force, more than twice the number of that of the invaders. He had with him the gentleman of the name of Buchanan, with the Grahams and other gentry of the Lennox, and a party of the citizens of Dumbarton, under command of Tobias Smollett, a magistrate or baillie of that town, an ancestor of the celebrated author. The parties met in the valley of Glen Fruin, which signifies the Glen of Sorrow, a name that seemed to anticipate the event of the day, which, fatal to the conquered party, was at least equally so to the victors, the babe unborn of Clan Alpine having reason to repent it. The MacGregors, somewhat discouraged by the appearance of a force much superior to their own, were cheered on to the attack by a seer or second-sighted person, who professed that he saw the shrouds of the dead wrapped around their principal opponents. The clan charged with great fury on the front of the enemy, while John MacGregor, with a strong party, made an unexpected attack on the flank. A great part of the Colquhoun's force consisted in cavalry, which could not act in the boggy ground. They were said to have disputed the field manfully, but were at length completely routed, and a merciless slaughter was exercised on the fugitives, of whom betwixt 200 and 300 fell on the field and in the pursuit. If the MacGregors lost, as is averred, only 2 men slain in the action, they had slight provocation for an indiscriminate massacre. It is said that their fury extended itself to a party of students for clerical orders, who had imprudently come to see the battle. Some doubt is thrown on this fact, from the indictment against the chief of the clan Gregor being silent on the subject, as is the historian Johnston, and a Professor Ross, who wrote an account of the battle 29 years after it was fought. It is, however, constantly averred, by the tradition of the country, and a stone where the deed was done is called Lecha Minster, the minster or clerk's flagstone. The MacGregors, by a tradition which is now found to be inaccurate, imputed this cruel action to the ferocity of a single man of their tribe, renowned for size and strength, called Dulgard, Kai War, or the Great Mouse-coloured Man. He was MacGregor's foster brother, and the chief committed the youths to his charge, with directions to keep them safely till the affray was over. Whether fearful of their escape, or incensed by some sarcasms which they threw on his tribe, or whether, out of mere thirst of blood, this savage, while the other MacGregors were engaged in the pursuit, poignarded his helpless and defenceless prisoners, when the chieftain, on his return, demanded where the youths were, the Ciar Mhor drew out his bloody dirk, saying in Gaelic, "Ask that, and God save me." The latter words alluded to the exclamation which his victims used when he was murdering them. It would seem, therefore, that this horrible part of the story is founded on fact, though the number of the youths so slain is probably exaggerated in the Lowland accounts. The common people say that the blood of the Ciar Mhor victims can never be washed off the stone. When MacGregor learnt their fate, he expressed the utmost horror at the deed, and upbraided his foster brother with having done that which would occasion the destruction of him and his clan. This supposed homicide was the ancestor of Rob Roy, and the tribe from which he was descended. He lies buried at the church at Fortingal, where his sepulchre, covered with a large stone, is still shown, and where his great strength and courage are the theme of many traditions. MacGregor's brother was one of the very few of the tribe who was slain. He was buried near the field of battle, and the place is marked by a rude stone, called the Grey Stone of MacGregor. Sir Humphrey Colquhoun, being well mounted, escaped for a time to the castle of Bannockor, or Bennecar. It proved no sure defence, however, for he was shortly after murdered in the vault of the castle. The family annals say, by the MacGregors, though other accounts charge the deeds upon the MacFarlanes. This battle of Glen Fruin, and the severity which the victors exercised in the pursuit, was reported to King James VI. In a manner the most unfavourable to the clan Gregor, whose general character, being that of lawless though brave men, could not much avail them in such a case. That James might fully understand the extent of the slaughter, the widows of the slain, to the number of 11 score, in deep mourning, riding upon white palfreys, and each bearing her husband's bloody shirt on a spear, appeared at Stirling, in presence of a monarch peculiarly accessible to such sights of fear and sorrow, to demand vengeance for the death of their husbands, upon those by whom they had been made desolate. The remedy resorted to was at least as severe as the cruelties which it was designed to punish. By an act of the Privy Council, dated 3rd April 1603, the name of MacGregor was expressly abolished, and those who had hitherto borne it were commanded to change it for other surnames, the pain of death being denounced against those who should call themselves Gregor or MacGregor, the names of their fathers. Under the same penalty, all who had been at the conflict of Glen Fruin, or accessory to other marauding parties charged in the act, were prohibited from carrying weapons, except a pointless knife to eat their victuals. By a subsequent Act of Council, 24th June 1613, death was announced against any persons of the tribe formerly called MacGregor, who should presume to assemble in greater numbers than 4. Again, by an Act of Parliament, 1617, chapter 26, these laws were continued and extended to the rising generation, in respect that great numbers of the children of those against whom the Acts of Privy Council had been directed were stated to be then approaching to maturity, who, if permitted to resume the name of their parents, would render the clan as strong as it was before. The execution of those severe acts was chiefly entrusted in the west to the Earl of Argyle and the powerful clan of Campbell, and to the Earl of Athol and his followers in the more eastern Highlands of Perthshire. The MacGregors failed not to resist with the most determined courage, and many a valley in the west and north Highlands retains memory of the severe conflicts, in which the proscribed clans sometimes obtained transient advantages, and always sold their lives dearly. At length the pride of Alistair MacGregor, the chief of the clan, was so much lowered by the sufferings of his people, that he resolved to surrender himself to the Earl of Argyle, with his principal followers, on condition that they should be sent out of Scotland. If the unfortunate chief's own account be true, he had more reasons than one for expecting some favour from the Earl, who had in secret advised and encouraged him to many of the desperate actions for which he was now called to so severe a reckoning. But Argyle, as old Birrell expresses himself, kept a Highlandman's promise with them, fulfilling it to the ear, and breaking it to the sense. MacGregor was sent under a strong guard to the frontier of England, and being thus, in the literal sense, sent out of Scotland, Argyle was judged to have kept faith with him, though the same party which took him there brought him back to Edinburgh in custody. MacGregor of Glanstry was tried before the Court of Justiciary, 20th of January 1604, and found guilty. He appears to have been instantly conveyed from the bar to the gallows, for Birrell, of the same date, reports that he was hanged at the cross, and, for distinction's sake, was suspended higher by his own height than 2 of his kindred and friends. End of Introduction, Part 1. Part 2 of Rob Roy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Rowan. Rob Roy by Sir Walter Scott. Volume 1. Introduction, Part 2. On the 18th of February following, more men of the MacGregors were executed after a long imprisonment, and several others in the beginning of March. The Earl of Argyle's service, in conducting to the surrender of the insolent and wicked race in name of MacGregor, notorious common malefactors, and in the bringing in of MacGregor, with a great many of the leading men of the clan, worthily executed to death for their offences, is thankfully acknowledged by an Act of Parliament, 1607, chapter 16, and rewarded with the grant of 20 chalders of victual out of the lands of Kintyre. The MacGregors, notwithstanding the letters of fire and sword, and orders for military execution, repeatedly directed against them by the Scottish legislator, who apparently lost all the calmness of conscious dignity and security, and could not even name the outlawed clan, without vituperation, showed no inclination to be blotted out of the roll of clanship, they submitted to the law, indeed, so far as to take the names of the neighbouring families amongst whom they happened to live, nominally becoming, as the case might render it most convenient, Drummonds, Campbells, Grahams, Buchanans, Stewarts, and the like; but to all intents and purposes of combination and mutual attachment they remained the clan Gregor, united together for right or wrong, and menacing with the general vengeance of their race all who committed aggressions against any individual of their number. They continued to take and give offence, with as little hesitation as before the legislative dispersion which had been attempted, as appears from the preamble to Statute 1633, chapter 30, setting forth that the clan Gregor, which had been suppressed and reduced to quietness by the great care of the late King James of eternal memory, had nevertheless broken out again, in the counties of Perth, Stirling, Clackmannan, Monteith, Lennox, Angus, and Mearns, for which reason the statute re establishes the disabilities attached to the clan, and grants a new commission for enforcing the laws against that wicked and rebellious race. Notwithstanding the extreme servitudes of King James I. and Charles I. against the unfortunate people, who were rendered furious by proscription, and then punished for yielding to the passions which had been wilfully irritated, the MacGregors, to a man, attached themselves during the civil war to the cause of the latter monarch. Their bards have ascribed this to the native respect of the MacGregors for the crown of Scotland, which their ancestors once wore, and have appealed to their armorial bearings, which display a pine tree crossed saltire wise, with a naked sword, the point of which supports a royal crown. But, without denying that such motives may have had their weight, we are disposed to think that a war which opened the Low Country to the raids of the clan Gregor would have more charms for them than any inducement to espouse the cause of the Covenanters, which would have brought them into contact with Highlanders as fierce as themselves, and having as little to lose. Patrick MacGregor, their leader, was the son of a distinguished chief, named Duncan Abbarach, to whom Montrose wrote letters as to his trusty and special friend, expressing his reliance on his devoted loyalty, with an assurance that when once his Majesty's affairs were placed upon a permanent footing, the grievances of the clan MacGregor should be readdressed. At a subsequent period of these melancholy times, we find the clan Gregor claiming the immunities of other tribes, when summoned by the Scottish Parliament to resist the invasion of the Commonwealth's army in 1651. On the last day of March in that year, a supplication to the King and Parliament, from Callum Macondachie, Fitz Ewan, and Ewan Macondachie, Ewan in their own name, and that of the whole names of MacGregor, set forth that while, in obedience to the orders of Parliament, enjoining all clans to come out in the present service under their chieftains, for the defence of religion, king, and kingdoms, the petitioners were drawing their men to guard the passes at the head of the river Forth. Set forth, that while, in obedience to the orders of Parliament, enjoining all clans to come out in the present service under their chieftains, for the defence of religion, king, and kingdoms, the petitioners were drawing their men to guard the passes at the head of the river Forth. They were interfered with by the Earl of Athole and the Laird of Buchanan, who had required the attendance of many of the clan Gregor upon their arrays. This interference was doubtless owing to the change of name, which seems to have given rise to the claim of the Earl of Athole and the Laird of Buchanan to muster the MacGregors under their banners, as Murrays or Buchanans. It does not appear that the petition of the MacGregors, to be permitted to come out in a body, as other clans, received any answer. But upon the Restoration, King Charles, in the first Scottish Parliament of his reign, Statute 1661, chapter 195, annulled the various acts against the clan Gregor, and restored them to the full use of their family name, and the other privileges of liege subjects, setting forth as a reason for this lenity that those who were formerly designed MacGregors had, during the late troubles, conducted themselves with such loyalty and affection to his Majesty as might justly wipe off all memory of further miscarriages, and take away all marks of reproach for the same. It is singular enough that it seems to have aggravated the feelings of the non-conforming Presbyterians, when the penalties which were most unjustly imposed upon themselves were relaxed towards the poor MacGregors. So little are the best men, any more than the worst, able to judge with impartiality of the same measures as applied to themselves or to others. Upon the Restoration, an influence inimical to this unfortunate clan, said to be the same with that which afterwards dictated the massacre of Glencoe, occasioned the re-enaction of the penal statutes against the MacGregors. There are no reasons given why these highly penal acts should have been renewed, nor is it alleged that the clan had been guilty of late irregularities. Indeed, there is some reason to think that the cause was formed of set purpose, in a shape which would elude observation. For, though continuing conclusions fatal to the rights of so many Scottish subjects, it is neither mentioned in the title nor in the rubric of the Act of Parliament in which it occurs, and is thrown briefly in at the close of the statute 1693, chapter 61, entitled An Act for the Justiciary in the Highlands. It does not, however, appear that after the Revolution the acts against the clan were severely enforced, and in the latter half of the 18th century they were not enforced at all. Commissioners of Supply were named in Parliament by the prescribed title of MacGregor, and decrees of courts of justice were pronounced, and legal deeds entered into, under the same appellative. The MacGregors, however, while the laws continued in the statute book, still suffered under the deprivation of the name which was their birthright, and some attempts were made for the purpose of adopting another, Alpine or Grant being proposed as the title of the whole clan in future. No agreement, however, could be entered into, and the evil was submitted to as a matter of necessity, and a full redress was obtained from the British Parliament by an act abolishing for ever the penal statutes which had been so long imposed upon this ancient race. This statute, while merited by the services of many a gentleman of the clan in behalf of their king and country, was passed, and the clan proceeded to act upon it with the same spirit of ancient times, which had made them suffer severely under a deprivation that would have been deemed of little consequence by a great part of their fellow subjects. They entered into a deed, recognising John Murray of Lanrick, Esquire, afterwards Sir John MacGregor, Baronet, representative of the family Glencarnock, as lawfully descended from the ancient stock and blood of the lairds and lords of MacGregor, and therefore acknowledged him as their chief on all lawful occasions and causes whatsoever. The deed was subscribed by 826 persons of the name of MacGregor capable of bearing arms. A great many of the clan during the last war formed themselves into what was called the Clan Alpine regiment, raised in 1799, under the command of their chief and his brother Colonel MacGregor. Having briefly noticed the history of this clan, which presents a rare and interesting example of the indelible character of the patriarchal system, the author must now offer some notices of the individual who gives name to these volumes. In giving an account of a Highlander, his pedigree is first to be considered. That of Rob Roy was deduced from Caer Hor, the great mouse-coloured man, who is accused by tradition of having slain the younger students at the battle of Glen Fruin. Without puzzling ourselves and our readers with the intricacies of Highland genealogy, it is enough to say, that after the death of Alistair MacGregor of Glanstree, the clan, discouraged by the unremitting persecution of their enemies, seems not to have had the means of placing themselves under the command of a single chief. According to their places of residence and immediate descent, the several families were led and directed by chieftains, which in the Highland acceptation signifies the head of a particular branch of a tribe, in opposition to chief, who is the leader and commander of the whole name. The family and descendants of Dugald Caer Mhor lived chiefly in the mountains between Loch Lomond and Loch Katrine, and occupied a good deal of property there, whether by sufferance, by the right of the sword, which it was never safe to dispute with them, or by the legal titles of various kinds, it would be useless to inquire and unnecessary to detail. Enough, there they certainly were, a people whom their most powerful neighbours were desirous to conciliate, their friendship in peace being very necessary to the quiet of the vicinage, and their assistance in war equally prompt and effectual. Rob Roy MacGregor Campbell, whose last name he bore in consequence of the Acts of Parliament abolishing his own, was the younger son of Donald MacGregor of Glengyle, said to have been a lieutenant colonel, probably in the service of James II., by his wife, a daughter of Campbell of Glenfalloch. Rob's own designation was of Inversnaid, but he appears to have acquired a right of some kind or other to the property or possession of Craig Royston, a domain of rock and forest lying on the east side of Loch Lomond, where the beautiful lake stretches into the dusky mountains of Glenfalloch. The time of his birth is uncertain, but he is said to have been active in the scenes of war and plunder which succeeded the Revolution, and tradition affirms him to have been the leader in a predatory incursion into the parish of Kippen, in the Lennox, which took place in the year 1691. It was of almost a bloodless character, only one person losing his life, but from the extent of the depredation it was long distinguished by the name of Heirship, or devastation, of Kippen. The time of his death is also uncertain, but he is said to have survived to the year 1733, and died an aged man. It is probable he may have been 25 about the time of the Heirship of Kippen, which would assign his birth to be the middle of the 17th century. In the more quiet times which succeed the Revolution, Rob Roy, or Red Robert, seems to have exerted his active talents, which were of no mean order, as a drover or trader in cattle, to a great extent. It may well be supposed that in those days no Lowland, much less English drovers, ventured to enter the Highlands. The cattle, which were the staple commodity of the mountains, were escorted down to fairs, on the borders of the Lowlands, by a party of Highlanders, with their arms rattling around them, and who dealt, however, in all honour and good faith with their southern customers. A fray indeed would sometimes arise when the Lowland men, chiefly borderers, who had to supply the English market, used to dip their bonnets in the next brook, and wrapping them round their hands, oppose their cudgels to the naked broadswords, which had not always a superiority. I have heard from aged persons, who had been engaged in such affrays, that the Highlanders used remarkably fair play, never using the point of the sword, far less their pistols or daggers, so that, with many a stiff thwack and many a bang, hard crabtree and cold iron rang. A slash or two, or a broken head, was easily accommodated, and as the trade was of benefit to both parties, trifling skirmishes were not allowed to interrupt its harmony. Indeed, it was of vital interest to the Highlanders, whose income, so far as derived from their estates, depended entirely on the sale of black cattle, and a sagacious and experienced dealer benefited not only himself, but his friends and neighbours by his speculations. Those of Rob Roy were for several years so successful as to inspire general confidence, and raise him in the estimation of the country in which he resided. His importance was increased by the death of his father, in consequence of which he succeeded to the management of his nephew, Gregor MacGregor, of Glengyle's property, and, as his tutor, to such influence with the clan and following as was due to the representative of Dugald Ciar. Such influence was the more uncontrolled, that this family of the MacGregors seemed to have refused adherence to MacGregor of Glencarnock, the ancestor of the present Sir Ewan MacGregor, and asserted a kind of independence. It was at this time that Rob Roy acquired an interest by purchase, wadset or otherwise, to the property of Craig Royston already mentioned. He was in particular favour, during this prosperous period of his life, with his nearest and most powerful neighbour, James, first Duke of Montrose, from whom he received many marks of regard. His Grace consented to give his nephew and himself a right of property on the estates of Glengyle and Inversnaid, which they had till then only held as kindly tenants. The Duke also, with a view to the interest of the country and his own estate, supported our adventurer by loans of money to a considerable amount, to enable him to carry on his speculations in the cattle trade. Unfortunately, that species of commerce was and is liable to sudden fluctuations, and Rob Roy was, by a sudden depression of markets, and, as a friendly tradition adds, by the bad faith of a partner named MacDonald, whom he had imprudently received into his confidence, and entrusted with a considerable sum of money, rendered totally insolvent. He absconded, of course, not empty-handed, if it be true, as stated in an advertisement for his apprehension, that he had in his possession sums to the amount of £1,000 sterling, obtained from several noblemen and gentlemen under pretence of purchasing cows from them in the Highlands. The advertisement appeared in June 1712, and was several times repeated. It fixes the period when Rob Roy exchanged his commercial adventures for speculations of a very different complexion. [Footnote: See Appendix No. 1. He appears at this period first to have removed from his ordinary dwelling at Inversnaid 10 or 12 Scots miles, which is double the number of English, farther into the Highlands, and commenced the lawless sort of life which he afterwards followed. The Duke of Montrose, who conceived himself deceived and cheated by MacGregor's conduct, employed legal means to recover the money lent to him. Rob Roy's landed property was attached by the regular form of legal procedure, and his stock and furniture made the subject of arrest and sale. It is said that this diligence of the law, as it is called in Scotland, which the English more bluntly term distress, was used in this case with uncommon severity, and that the legal satellites, not usually the gentlest persons in the world, had insulted MacGregor's wife in a manner which would have aroused a milder man than he to thoughts of unbounded vengeance. She was a woman of fierce and haughty temper, and it is not unlikely to have disturbed the officers in the execution of their duty, and thus to have incurred ill treatment, though, for the sake of humanity, it is to be hoped that the story sometimes told is a popular exaggeration. It is certain that she felt extreme anguish at being expelled from the banks of Loch Lomond, and gave vent to her feelings in a fine piece of pipe music, still well known to amateurs by the name of Rob Roy's Lament. The fugitive is thought to have found his first place of refuge in Glendochat, under the Earl of Breadalbane's protection, for, though that family had been active agents in the destruction of the MacGregors in former times, they had of late years sheltered a great many of the name in their old possessions. The Duke of Argyle was also one of Rob Roy's protectors, so far as to afford him, according to the Highland phrase, wood and water, the shelter, namely, that is afforded by the forests and lakes of an inaccessible country. The great men of the Highlands in that time, besides being anxiously ambitious to keep up what was called their following, or military retainers, were also desirous to have at their disposal men of resolute character, to whom the world and the world's law were no friends, and who might at times ravish the lands or destroy the tenants of a feudal enemy, without bringing responsibility on their patrons. The strife between the names of Campbell and Graham during the civil wars of the 17th century had been stamped with mutual loss and inveterate enmity. The death of the great Marquess of Montrose on one side, the defeat at Inverlochy, and the cruel plundering of Lorn on the other, were reciprocal injuries not likely to be forgotten. Rob Roy was, therefore, sure of refuge in the country of the Campbells, both as having assumed their name as connected by his mother with the family of Glenfalloch, and as an enemy to the rival house of Montrose. The extent of Argyle's possessions, and the power of retreating thither in any emergency, gave great encouragement to the bold schemes of revenge which he had adopted. This was nothing short of the maintenance of a predatory war against the Duke of Montrose, whom he considered as the author of his exclusion from civil society, and of the outlawry to which he had been sentenced by letters of horning and caption, legal writs so called, as well as the seizure of his goods and adjudication of his landed property. Against his Grace, therefore, his tenants, friends, allies, and relatives, he disposed himself to employ every means of annoyance in his power, And though this was a circle sufficiently extensive for active depredation, Rob, who professed himself a Jacobite, took the liberty of extending his sphere of operations against all whom he chose to consider as friendly to the revolutionary government, or to that most obnoxious of measures, the union of the kingdoms. Under one or other of these pretexts, all his neighbours of the Lowlands who had anything to lose, or were unwilling to compound for security by paying him an annual sum for protection or forbearance, were exposed to his ravages. The country in which this private warfare or system of depredation was to be carried on was, until opened up by roads, in the highest degree favourable for his purpose. It was broken up into narrow valleys, the habitable part of which bore no proportion to the huge wilderness of forest, rocks, and precipices by which they were encircled, and which was, moreover, full of inextricable passes, morasses, and natural strengths, unknown to any but the inhabitants themselves, where a few men acquainted with the ground were capable, with ordinary address, of baffling the pursuit of numbers. The opinions and habits of the nearest neighbours to the Highland line were also highly favourable to Rob Roy's purpose. A large proportion of them were of his own clan of MacGregor, who claimed the property of Balquhidder and other Highland districts, as having been part of the ancient possessions of their tribe, though the harsh laws, under the severity of which they had suffered so deeply, had assigned the ownership to other families. The civil wars of the 17th century had accustomed these men to the use of arms, and they were peculiarly brave and fierce for remembrance of their sufferings. The vicinity of a comparatively rich lowland district gave also great temptations to incursion. Many belonging to other clans, habituated to contempt of industry and to the use of arms, drew towards an unprotected frontier which promised facility of plunder, and the state of the country, now so peaceable and quiet, verified at that time the opinion which Dr. Johnson heard with doubt and suspicion, that the most disorderly and lawless districts of the Highlands were those which lay nearest to the Lowland line. There was therefore no difficulty in Rob Roy, descendant of a tribe which was widely dispersed in the country we have described, collecting any number of followers whom he might be able to keep in action and to maintain by his proposed operations. He himself appears to have been singularly adapted for the profession which he proposed to exercise. His stature was not of the tallest, but his person was uncommonly strong and compact. The great peculiarities of his frame were the breadth of his shoulders, and the great and almost disproportionate length of his arms, so remarkable, indeed, that it was said that he could, without stooping, tie the garters of his Highland hose, which are placed 2 inches below the knee. His countenance was open, manly, stern at periods of danger, but frank and cheerful in his hours of festivity. His hair was dark red, thick and frizzled, and curled short around the face. His fashion of dress showed, of course, the knees and upper part of the leg, which was described to me as resembling that of a Highland bull, hirsute, with red hair and evincing muscular strength similar to that animal. To these personal qualifications must be added a masterly use of the Highland sword, in which his length of arm gave him great advantage, and a perfect and intimate knowledge of all the recesses of the wild country in which he harboured, and the character of the various individuals, whether friendly or hostile, with whom he might come in contact. His mental qualities seem to have been no less adapted to the circumstances in which he was placed. Though the descendant of the bloodthirsty Ciar Mhor, he inherited none of his ancestors' ferocity. On the contrary, Rob Roy avoided every appearance of cruelty, and it was not averred that he was ever the means of unnecessary bloodshed, or the actor in any deed which could lead the way to it. His schemes of plunder were contrived and executed with equal boldness and sagacity, and were almost universally successful, from the skill with which they were laid, and the secrecy and rapidity with which they were executed. Like Robin Hood of England, he was a kind and gentle robber, and while he took from the rich, was liberal in relieving the poor. This might in part be policy, but the universal tradition from the country speaks it to have arisen from a better motive. All whom I have conversed with, and I have in my youth seen some who knew Rob Roy personally, gave him the character of a benevolent and humane man, in his way. His ideas of morality were those of an Arab chief, being such as naturally arose out of his wild education. Supposing Rob Roy to have argued on the tendency of the life which he pursued, whether from choice or from necessity, he would doubtless have assumed to himself the character of a brave man, who, deprived of his natural rights by the partiality of laws, endeavoured to assert them by a strong hand of natural power; and he is most felicitously described as reasoning thus, in the high-toned poetry of my gifted friend Wordsworth: Say then that he was wise as brave, as wise in thought as bold in deed, for in the principle of things he sought his moral creed. Said generous Rob, what need of books? Burn all the statutes and their shells, they stir us up against our kind, and worst against ourselves. We have a passion, make a law, too false to guide us or control, and for the law itself we fight in bitterness of soul. And puzzled, blinded, then we lose distinctions that are plain and few. These find I graven on my heart, that tells me what to do. The creatures see of flood and field, and those that travel on the wind, with them no strife can last, they live in peace, and peace of mind. For why? Because the good old rule sufficeth them, the simple plan, that they should take who have the power, and they should keep who can. A lesson which is quickly learned, a signal through which all can see, thus nothing here provokes the strong to wanton cruelty. And freakishness of mind is checked, he tamed who foolishly aspires, while to the measure of his might each fashions his desires. All kinds and creatures stand and fall by strength of prowess or of wit. 'Tis God's appointment who must sway, and who is to submit. Since then, said Robin, right is plain, and longest life is but a day, to have my ends, maintain my rights, I'll take the shortest way. And thus among these rocks he lived, through summer's heat and winter's snow. The eagle he was lord above, and Rob was lord below. We are not, however, to suppose the character of this distinguished outlaw to be that of an actual hero, acting uniformly and consistently on such moral principles as the illustrious bard who, standing by his grave, has vindicated his fame. On the contrary, as is common with barbarous chiefs, Rob Roy appears to have mixed his professions of principle with a large alloy of craft and dissimulation, of which his conduct during the civil war is sufficient proof. It is also said, and truly, that although his courtesy was one of the strongest characteristics, yet sometimes he assumed an arrogance of manner which was not easily endured by the high-spirited men to whom it was addressed, and drew the daring outlaw into frequent disputes, from which he did not always come off with credit. From this it has been inferred that Rob Roy was more of a bully than a hero, or at least that he had, according to the common phrase, his fighting days. Some aged men who knew him well have described him also as better at attack Toulouse, or scuffle within doors, than in mortal combat. The tenor of his life may be quoted to repel this charge, while at the same time it must be allowed that the situation in which he was placed rendered him prudently averse to maintaining quarrels where nothing was to be had save blows, and where success would have raised up against him new and powerful enemies, in a country where revenge was still considered as a duty rather than a crime. The power of commanding his passions on such occasions, far from being inconsistent with the part which MacGregor had to perform, was essentially necessary, at the period when he lived, to prevent his career from being cut short. End of Introduction, Part 2.
Introduction, Part 3 of Rob Roy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Harris. Rob Roy by Sir Walter Scott, Volume 1, Introduction, Part 3. I may here mention one or two occasions on which Rob Roy appears to have given way in the manner alluded to. My late venerable friend, John Ramsay of Ochtertyre, alike eminent as a classic scholar and as an authentic register of the ancient history and manners of Scotland, informed me that on occasion of a public meeting at a bonfire in the town of Doune, Rob Roy gave some offence to James Edmonstone of Newton, the same gentleman who was unfortunately concerned in the slaughter of Lord Rollo. See Maclaurin's Criminal Trials, No. 9. When Edmonstone compelled MacGregor to quit the town on pain of being thrown by him into the bonfire, "I broke one off your ribs on a former occasion," said he, "and now, Rob, if you provoke me further, I'll break your neck." But it must be remembered that Edmonstone was a man of consequence in the Jacobite party, as he carried the royal standard of James VII. At the battle of Sheriffmuir, and also that he was near the door of his own mansion house, and probably surrounded by his friends and adherents. Rob Roy, however, suffered in reputation for retiring under such a threat. Another well-vouched case is that of Cunningham of Boken. Henry Cunningham, Esquire, of Boken, was a gentleman of Stirlingshire, who, like many exquisites of our own time, united a natural high spirit and daring character with an affectation of delicacy of address and manners amounting to foppery. Note, his courage and affectation of foppery were united, which is less frequently the case, with a spirit of innate modesty. He is thus described in Lord Binning's satirical verses entitled Argyle's Levy. The Duke then, turning round well pleased, said, "Sure you've been in France." A more polite and jaunty man I never saw before. Then Harry bowed and blushed and bowed and strutted to the door. See a collection of original poems by Scotch Gentlemen, Volume 2, page 125. He chanced to be in company with Rob Roy, who, either in contempt of Boken's supposed effeminacy, or because he thought him a safe person to fix a quarrel on, a point which Rob's enemies alleged he was wont to consider, insulted him so grossly that a challenge passed between them. The goodwife of the Clachan had hidden Cunningham's sword, and while he rummaged the house in quest of his own or some other, Rob Roy went to the Shealing Hill, the appointed place of combat, and paraded there with great majesty, waiting for his antagonist. In the meantime, Cunningham had managed to rummage out an old sword, and, entering the ground of contest in all haste, rushed on the outlaw with such unexpected fury that he fairly drove him off the field, nor did he show himself in the village again for some time. Mr. MacGregor Stirling has a softened account of this anecdote in his new edition of Nimmo's Stirlingshire. Still, he records Rob Roy's discomfiture. Occasionally Rob Roy suffered disasters and incurred great personal danger. On one remarkable occasion he was saved by the coolness of his lieutenant, Macanaleister of Fletcher, the Little John of his band, a fine active fellow, of course, and celebrated as a marksman. It happened that MacGregor and his party had been surprised and dispersed by a superior force of horse and foot, and the word was given to split and squander. Each shifted for himself, but a bold dragoon attached himself to pursuit of Rob, and, overtaking him, struck at him with his broadsword. A plate of iron in his bonnet saved the MacGregor from being cut down to the teeth, but the blow was heavy enough to bear him to the ground, crying as he fell, "Oh, Macanaleister, is there naething in her?" i.e. in the gun. The trooper at the same time exclaiming, "Damn ye, your mother never wrought your nightcap," had his arm raised for a second blow, when Macanaleister fired, and the ball pierced the dragoon's heart. Such as he was, Rob Roy's progress in his occupation is thus described by a gentleman of sense and talent, who resided within the circle of his predatory wars, had probably felt their effects, and speaks of them, as might be expected, with little of the forbearance with which, from their peculiar and romantic character, they are now regarded. This man, Rob Roy MacGregor, was a person of sagacity, and neither wanted stratagem nor address, and having abandoned himself to all licentiousness, set himself at the head of all the loose, vagrant, and desperate people of that clan. in the west end of Perth and Stirlingshires, and infested those whole countries with thefts, robberies, and depredations. Very few who lived within his reach, that is, within the distance of a nocturnal expedition, could promise to themselves security, either for their persons or effects, without subjecting themselves to pay him a heavy and shameful tax of blackmail. He at last proceeded to such a degree of audaciousness that he committed robberies, raised contributions, and resented quarrels, at the head of a very considerable body of armed men, in open day, and in the face of the government. From Mr. Graham of Gartmore's Causes of the Disturbances in the Highlands. See Jameson's edition of Burt's Letters from the North of Scotland, Appendix, Volume 2, page 348. The extent and success of these depredations cannot be surprising when we consider that the scene of them was laid in a country where the general law was neither enforced nor respected. Having recorded that the general habit of cattle stealing had blinded even those of the better classes to the infamy of the practice, and that as men's property consisted entirely in herds, it was rendered in the highest degree precarious, Mr. Graham adds. On those accounts there is no culture of ground, no improvement of pastures, and from the same reasons no manufactures, no trade, in short, no industry. The people are extremely prolific, and therefore so numerous that there is not business in that country, according to its present order and economy, for the one half of them. Every place is full of idle people, accustomed to arms, and lazy in everything but rapines and depredations. As buddle or aquavitae houses are to be found everywhere throughout the country, so in these they saunter away their time, and frequently consume there the returns of their illegal purchases. Here the laws have never been executed, nor the authority of the magistrate ever established. Here the officer of the law neither dare nor can execute his duty, and several places are about 30 miles from lawful persons. In short, there is no order, no authority, no government. The period of the rebellion, 1715, approached soon after Rob Roy had attained celebrity. His Jacobite partialities were now placed in opposition to his sense of the obligations which he owed to the indirect protection of the Duke of Argyle. But the desire of drowning his sounding steps amid the din of general war induced him to join the forces of the Earl of Mar, although his patron the Duke of Argyle was at the head of the army opposed to the Highland insurgents. The MacGregors, a large sept of them at least, that of Cienmore, on this occasion were not commanded by Rob Roy, but by his nephew, already mentioned, Gregor MacGregor, otherwise called James Graham of Glengyle, and still better remembered by the Gaelic epithet Glen dhu, i.e. black knee, from a black spot on one of his knees, which his Highland garb rendered visible. There can be no question, however, that being then very young, Glengyle must have acted on most occasions by the advice and direction of so experienced a leader as his uncle. The MacGregors assembled in numbers at that period, and began even to threaten the lowlands towards the lower extremity of Loch Lomond. They suddenly seized all the boats which were upon the lake, and, probably with a view to some enterprise of their own, drew them overland to Inversnaid, in order to intercept the progress of a large body of west country Whigs, who were in arms for the government, and moving in that direction. The Whigs made an excursion for the recovery of the boats. Their forces consisted of volunteers from Paisley, Kilpatrick, and elsewhere, who, with the assistance of a body of seamen, were towed up the river Leven in longboats belonging to the ships of war then lying in the Clyde. At Luss they were joined by the forces of Sir Humphrey Colquhoun, and James Grant, his son-in-law, with their followers, attired in the Highland dress of the period, which is picturesquely described. At night they arrived at Luss, where they were joined by Sir Humphrey Colquhoun of Luss, and James Grant of Placander, his son-in-law, followed by 40 or 50 stately fellows in their short hose and belted plaids, armed each of them with a well-fixed gun on his shoulder, a strong handsome target with a sharp-pointed steel of above half an ell in length screwed into the navel of it on his left arm, a sturdy claymore by his side, and a pistol or two with a dirk and knife in his belt. That description from Ray's History of the Rebellion, page 287. The whole party crossed to Craig Royston, but the MacGregors did not offer combat. If we are to believe the account of the expedition given by the historian Ray, they leaped on shore at Craig Royston with the utmost intrepidity, no enemy appearing to oppose them, and by the noise of their drums, which they beat incessantly, and the discharge of their artillery and small arms, terrified the MacGregors, whom they appear never to have seen, out of their fastnesses, and caused them to fly in a panic to the general camp of the Highlanders at Strathfillan. The Low Country men succeeded in getting possession of the boats at a great expenditure of noise and courage, and little risk of danger. After this temporary removal from his old haunts, Rob Roy was sent by the Earl of Mar to Aberdeen, to raise, it is believed, a part of the clan MacGregor, which is settled in that country. These men were of his own family, the race of Sieur Moor. They were the descendants of about 300 MacGregors, whom the Earl of Murray, about the year 1624, transported from his estates in Menteith to oppose against his enemies the Macintoshes, a race as hardy and restless as they were themselves. But while in the city of Aberdeen, Rob Roy met a relation of a very different class and character from those he was sent to summon to arms. This was Dr. James Gregory, by descent a MacGregor, the patriarch of a dynasty of professors distinguished for literature and scientific talent, and the grandfather of the late eminent physician and accomplished scholar, Professor Gregory of Edinburgh. This gentleman was at the time professor of medicine in King's College, Aberdeen, and son of Dr. James Gregory, distinguished in science as the inventor of the reflecting telescope. With such a family it may seem our friend Rob could have had little communion, but civil war is a species of misery which introduces men to strange bedfellows. Dr. Gregory thought it a point of prudence to claim kindred, at so critical a period, with a man so formidable and influential. He invited Rob Roy to his house, and treated him with so much kindness that he produced in his generous bosom a degree of gratitude which seemed likely to occasion very inconvenient effects. The Professor had a son about 8 or 9 years old, a lively, stout boy of his age, with whose appearance our Highland Robin Hood was much taken. On the day before his departure from the house of his learned relative, Rob Roy, who had pondered deeply how he might requite his cousin's kindness, took Dr. Gregory aside, and addressed him to this purport: "My dear kinsman, I have been thinking what I could do to show my sense of your hospitality. Now here you have a fine spirited boy of a son whom you are ruining by cramming him with your useless book learning, and I am determined, by way of manifesting my great goodwill to you and yours, to take him with me and make a man of him." The learned Professor was utterly overwhelmed when his warlike kinsman announced his kind purpose, in language which implied no doubt of its being a proposal which would he, and ought to be, accepted with the utmost gratitude. The task of apology or explanation was of a most delicate description, and there might have been considerable danger in suffering Rob Roy to perceive that the promotion with which he threatened the son was, in the father's eyes, the ready road to the gallows. Indeed, every excuse which he could at first think of, such as regret for putting his friend to trouble with a youth who had been educated in the Lowlands, and so on, only strengthened the chieftain's inclination to patronize his young kinsman, as he supposed they arose entirely from the modesty of the father. He would for a long time take no apology, and even spoke of carrying off the youth by a certain degree of kindly violence, whether his father consented or not. At length the perplexed Professor pleaded that his son was very young, and in infirm state of health, and not yet able to endure the hardships of a mountain life, but that in another year or two he hoped his health would be firmly established, and he would be in a fitting condition to attend on his brave kinsman, and follow out the splendid destinies to which he opened the way. This agreement being made, the cousins parted, Rob Roy pledging his honour to carry his young relation to the hills with him on his next return to Aberdeenshire, and Dr. Gregory, doubtless, praying in his secret soul that he might never see Rob's Highland face again. James Gregory, who thus escaped being his kinsman's recruit, and in all probability his henchman, was afterwards professor of medicine in the college, and, like most of his family, distinguished by his scientific acquirements. He was rather of an irritable and pertinacious disposition, and his friends were wont to remark, when he showed any symptom of these foibles, "Ha! this comes from not having been educated by Rob Roy." connection between Rob Roy and his classical kinsman did not end with the period of Rob's transient power. At a period considerably subsequent to the year 1715, he was walking in the Castle Street of Aberdeen, arm in arm with his host, Dr. James Gregory, when the drums in the barracks suddenly beat to arms, and soldiers were seen issuing from the barracks. "If these lads are turning out," said Rob, taking leave of his cousin with great composure, "it's time for me to look after me safety." So saying, he dived down a close, and, as John Bunyan says, went upon his way and was seen no more. The first of these anecdotes, which brings the highest pitch of civilization so closely in contact with the half savage state of society, I have heard told by the late distinguished Dr. Gregory, and the members of his family have had the kindness to collate the story with their recollections and family documents, and furnish the authentic particulars. The second rests on the recollection of an old man, who was present when Rob took French leave of his literary cousin on hearing the drums beat, and communicated the circumstance to Mr. Alexander Forbes, a connection of Dr. Gregory by marriage, who is still alive. We have already stated that Rob Roy's conduct during the insurrection of 1715 was very equivocal. His person and followers were in the Highland army, but his heart seems to have been with the Duke of Argyle's. Yet the insurgents were constrained to trust to him as their only guide, when they marched from Perth towards Dunblane, with the view of crossing the Forth at what are called the fords of Fruin, and when they themselves said he could not be relied upon. This movement to the westward on the part of the insurgents brought on the battle of Sheriffmuir, indecisive indeed in its immediate results, but of which the Duke of Argyle reaped the whole advantage. In this action it will be recollected that the right wing of the Highlanders broke and cut to pieces Argyle's left wing, while the clans on the left of Mar's army, though consisting of Stewarts, Mackenzies, and Camerons, were completely routed. During this medley of flight and pursuit, Rob Roy retained his station on a hill in the centre of the Highland position, and though it said his attack might have decided the day, he could not be prevailed upon to charge. This was the more unfortunate for the insurgents, as the leading of a party of the Macphersons had been committed to MacGregor. This, it is said, was owing to the age and infirmity of the chief of that name, who, unable to lead his clan in person, objected to his heir apparent, Macpherson of Nord, discharging his duty on that occasion, so that the tribe, or a part of them, were brigaded with their allies, the MacGregors. While the favourable moment for action was gliding away unemployed, Mar's positive orders reached Rob Roy that he should presently attack, to which he coolly replied, "Nay, nay, if they cannot do it without me, they cannot do it with me." One of the Macphersons, named Alexander, one of Rob's original profession, videlicet, a drover, but a man of great strength and spirit, was so incensed at the inactivity of this temporary leader, that he threw off his plaid, drew his sword, and called out to his clansmen, "Let us endure this no longer. If ye'll not lead you, I will." Rob Roy replied with great coolness, "Were the question about driving Highland stots or kyloes, Sandy, I'd yield to your superior skill, but as it respects the leading of men, I must be allowed to be the better judge." "Did the matter respect driving Glen Eagle's stouts," answered the Macpherson, "the question with Rob would not be which was to be last, but which was to be foremost." Incensed at this sarcasm, MacGregor drew his sword, and they would have fought upon the spot if their friends on both sides had not interfered. But the moment of attack was completely lost. Rob did not, however, neglect his own private interest on the occasion. In the confusion of an undecided field of battle, he enriched his followers by plundering the baggage and the dead on both sides. The fine old satirical ballad on the Battle of Sheriffmuir does not forget to stigmatize our hero's conduct on this memorable occasion. "Rob Roy he stood watch on a hill for to catch the booty, for aught that I saw, man. For he ne'er advanced from the place where he stanced, till nae mair was to do there at a', man." Notwithstanding the sort of neutrality which Rob Roy had continued to observe during the progress of the rebellion, he did not escape some of its penalties. He was included in the Act of Attainder, and the house in Breadalbane, which was his place of retreat, was burned by General Lord Cadogan, when, after the conclusion of the insurrection, he marched through the Highlands to disarm and punish the offending clans. But upon going to Inverary with about 40 or 50 of his followers, Rob obtained favour by an apparent surrender of their arms to Colonel Patrick Campbell of Finnah, who furnished them and their leader with protections under his hand. Being thus in a great measure secured from the resentment of Government, Rob Roy established his residence at Craig Royston, near Loch Lomond, in the midst of his own kinsmen, and lost no time in resuming his private quarrel with the Duke of Montrose. For this purpose he soon got on foot as many men, and well armed too, as he had yet commanded. He never stirred without a bodyguard of 10 or 12 picked followers, and without much effort could increase them to 50 or 60. The Duke was not wanting in efforts to destroy this troublesome adversary. His Grace applied to General Carpenter, commanding the forces in Scotland, and by his orders 3 parties of soldiers were directed from the 3 different points of Glasgow, Stirling, and Finlarig, near Killin. Mr. Graham of Killearn, the Duke of Montrose's relation and factor, Sheriff Depute also of Dumbartonshire, accompanied the troops, that they might act upon the civil authority, and have the assistance of a trusty guide well acquainted with the hills. It was the object of these several columns to arrive about the same time in the neighbourhood of Rob Roy's residence, and surprise him and his followers; but heavy rains, the difficulties of the country, and the good intelligence which the outlaw was always supplied with, disappointed their well concerted combination. The troops, finding the birds were flown, avenged themselves by destroying the nest. They burned Rob Roy's house, though not with impunity, for the MacGregors, concealed among the thickets and cliffs, fired on them and killed a grenadier. Rob Roy avenged himself for the loss which he sustained on this occasion by an act of singular audacity. About the middle of November 1716, John Graham of Killearn, already mentioned as factor of the Montrose family, went to a place called Chapel Errock, where the tenants of the Duke were summoned to appear with their termly rents. They appeared accordingly, and the factor had received ready money to the amount of about £300, when Rob Roy entered the room at the head of an armed party. The steward endeavoured to protect the Duke's property by throwing the books of accounts and money into a garret, trusting they might escape notice, but the experienced freebooter was not to be baffled where such a prize was at stake. He recovered the books and the cash, placed himself calmly in the receipt of custom, examined the accounts, pocketed the money, and gave receipts on the Duke's part, saying he would hold reckoning with the Duke of Montrose out of the damages which he had sustained by his Grace's means, in which he included the losses he had suffered, as well by the burning of his house by General Cadogan, as by the later expedition against Craig Royston. He then requested Mr. Graham to attend him, nor does it appear that he treated him with any personal violence, or even rudeness, although he informed him he regarded him as a hostage, and menaced rough usage in case he should be pursued, or in danger of being overtaken. Few more audacious feats have been performed. After some rapid changes of place, the fatigue attending which was the only annoyance that Mr. Graham seems to have complained of, he carried his prisoner to an island on Loch Katrine, and caused him to write to the Duke to state that his ransom was fixed at 3,400 merks pounds, being the balance which MacGregor pretended remained due to him, after deducting all that he owed to the Duke of Montrose. However, after detaining Mr. Graham 5 or 6 days in custody on the island, which is still called Rob Roy's prison, and could be no comfortable dwelling for November nights, the outlaw seems to have despaired of attaining further advantage from his bold attempt, and suffered his prisoner to depart uninjured with the account books and bills granted by the tenants, taking special care to retain the cash. The reader will find 2 original letters of the Duke of Montrose, with that which Mr. Graham of Killearn dispatched from his prison house by the outlaw's command, in the appendix No. 2. About 1717 our chieftain had the dangerous adventure of falling into the hands of the Duke of Atholl, almost as much his enemy as the Duke of Montrose himself, but his cunning and dexterity again freed him from certain death. See a contemporary account of this curious affair in the appendix No. 5. Other pranks are told of Rob, which argue the same boldness and sagacity as the seizure of Killearn. The Duke of Montrose, weary of his insolence, procured a quantity of arms, and distributed them among his tenantry, in order that they might defend themselves against future violences. But they fell into different hands from those they were intended for. The MacGregors made separate attacks on the houses of the tenants, and disarmed them all, one after another, not, as was supposed, without the consent of many of the persons so disarmed. As a great part of the Duke's rents were payable in kind, there were girnels (granaries) established for storing up the corn at Moulin, and elsewhere on the Buchanan estate. To these storehouses Rob Roy used to repair with a sufficient force, and of course when he was least expected, and insist upon the delivery of quantities of grain, sometimes for his own use, and sometimes for the assistance of the country people, always giving regular receipts in his own name, and pretending to reckon with the Duke for what sums he received. In the meantime a garrison was established by Government, the ruins of which may still be seen about half way betwixt Loch Lomond and Loch Katrine, upon Rob Roy's original property of Inversnaid. Even this military establishment could not bridle the restless MacGregor. He contrived to surprise the little fort, disarm the soldiers, and destroy the fortification. It was afterwards re-established, and again taken by the MacGregors under Rob Roy's nephew, Glen, previous to the insurrection of 1745-6. Finally, the fort of Inversnaid was a third time repaired after the extinction of civil discord, and when we find the celebrated General Wolfe commanding in it, the imagination is strongly affected by the variety of time and events which the circumstance brings simultaneously to recollection. It is now totally dismantled. About 1792, when the author chanced to pass that way while on a tour through the Highlands, a garrison consisting of a single veteran was still maintaining at Inversnaid. The venerable warder was reaping his barley croft in all peace and tranquillity, and when we asked admittance to repose ourselves, he told us we would find the key to the fort under the door. It was not, strictly speaking, as a professed depredator that Rob Roy now conducted his operations, but as a sort of contractor for the police, in Scottish phrase, a lifter of Blackmail. The nature of this contract has been described in the novel of Waverley, and in the notes on that work. Mr. Graham of Gartmore's description of the character may be here transcribed. The confusion and disorders of the country were so great, and the government so absolutely neglected it, that the sober people were obliged to purchase some security to their effects by shameful and ignominious contracts of blackmail. A person who had the greatest correspondence with the thieves was agreed with to preserve the lands contracted for from thefts, for certain sums to be paid yearly. Upon this fund he employed one half of the thieves to recover stolen cattle, and the other half of them to steal, in order to make this agreement and blackmail contract necessary. The estates of those gentlemen who refuse to contract, or give countenance to that pernicious practice, are plundered by the thieving part of the watch, in order to force them to purchase their protection. Their leader calls himself the Captain of the Watch, and his banditti go by that name, and as this gives them a kind of authority to traverse the country, so it makes them capable of doing any mischief. These corps through the Highlands make altogether a very considerable body of men, inured from their infancy to the greatest fatigues, and very capable to act in a military way when occasion offers. People who are ignorant and enthusiastic, who are in absolute dependence upon their chief or landlord, who are directed in their consciousness by Roman Catholic priests or non-juring clergymen, and who are not masters of any property, may easily be formed into any mould. They fear no dangers, as they have nothing to lose, and so can with ease be induced to attempt anything. Nothing can make their condition worse. Confusions and troubles do commonly indulge them in such licentiousness, that by these they better it. That from Letters from the North of Scotland, Volume 2, pages 344-345. End of Volume 1, Section 3. Introduction. Recording by Mike Harris. Introduction, Part 4 of Rob Roy, by Sir Walter Scott. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Harris. Rob Roy, by Sir Walter Scott, Volume 1, Introduction, Part 4. As the practice of contracting for blackmail was an obvious encouragement to rapine, and a great obstacle to the course of justice, it was, by the statute of 1567, chapter 21, declared a capital crime both on the part of him who levied and him who paid this sort of tax. But the necessity of the case prevented the execution of this severe law, I believe, in at least one instance, and men went on submitting to a certain unlawful imposition rather than run the risk of utter ruin, just as it is now found difficult or impossible to prevent those who have lost a very large sum of money by robbery from compounding with the felons for restoration of a part of their booty. At what rate Rob Roy levied blackmail I never heard stated, but there is a formal contract by which his nephew, in 1741, agreed with various landlords of estates in the counties of Perth, Stirling, and Dumbarton, to recover cattle stolen from them, or to pay the value within 6 months of the loss being intimated, if such intimation were made to him with sufficient dispatch, in consideration of a payment of £5 on each £100 of valued rent, which was not a very heavy insurance. Petty thefts were not included in the contract, but the theft of one horse, or one head of black cattle, or of sheep exceeding the number of 6, fell under the agreement. Rob Roy's profits upon such contracts brought him in a considerable revenue in money or cattle, of which he made a popular use, for he was publicly liberal as well as privately beneficent. The minister of the parish of Balquhidder, whose name was Robertson, was at one time threatening to pursue the parish for an augmentation of his stipend. Rob Roy took an opportunity to assure him that he would do well to abstain from this new exaction, a hint which the minister did not fail to understand. But to make him some indemnification, MacGregor presented him every year with a cow and a fat sheep, and no scruples as to the mode in which the donor came by them are said to have affected the reverend gentleman's conscience. The following amount of the proceedings of Rob Roy, on an application to him from one of his contractors, had in it something very interesting to me, as told by an old countryman in the Lennox who was present on the expedition. But as there is no point or marked incident in the story, and as it must necessarily be without the half frightened, half bewildered look with which the narrator accompanied his recollections, it may possibly lose its effect when transferred to paper. My informant stated himself to have been a lad of 15, living with his father on the estate of a gentleman in the Lennox, whose name I have forgotten, in the capacity of herd. On a fine morning in the end of October, the period when such calamities were almost always to be apprehended, they found the Highland thieves had been down upon them and swept away 10 or 12 head of cattle. Rob Roy was sent for, and came with a party of 7 or 8 armed men. He heard with great gravity all that could be told him of the circumstances of the crech, and expressed his confidence that the herd widdyfowls, or mad herdsman, a name given to cattle stealers, properly one who deserves to fill a widdy or a halter. Anyway, the herd widdyfowls could not have carried their booty far, and that he should be able to recover them. He desired that 2 Lowlanders should be sent on the party, as it was not to be expected that any of his gentlemen would take the trouble of driving the cattle when he should recover possession of them. My informant and his father were dispatched on the expedition. They had no good will to the journey, nevertheless, provided with a little food and with a dog to help them to manage the cattle, they set off with MacGregor. They travelled a long day's journey in the direction of the mountain Benvoirlich, and slept for the night in a ruinous hut or bothy. The next morning they resumed their journey among the hills, Rob Roy directing their course by signs and marks on the heath which my informant did not understand. About noon Rob commanded the armed party to halt and to lie couched in the heather, where it was the thickest. "Do you and your son," he said to the oldest Lowlander, "go boldly over the hill you'll see beneath you, in a glen on the other side, your master's cattle feeding, it may be, with others. Gather your own together, taking care to disturb no one else, and drive them to this place. If anyone speak to you or threaten you, tell them that I am here at the head of 20 men." "But what if they abuse us or kill us?" said the Lowland peasant, by no means delighted at finding the embassy imposed on him and his son. "If they do you any wrong," said Rob, "I'll never forgive them as long as I live." The Lowlander was by no means content with this security, but did not think it safe to dispute Rob's injunctions. He and his son climbed the hill, therefore, found a deep valley, where they grazed, as Rob had predicted, a large herd of cattle. They cautiously selected those which their master had lost, and took measures to drive them over the hill. As soon as they began to remove them, they were surprised by hearing cries and screams, and, looking around in fear and trembling, they saw a woman, seeming to have started out of the earth, who flyted at them, that is, scolded them in Gaelic. When they contrived, however, in the best Gaelic they could muster, to deliver the message Rob Roy told them, she became silent, and disappeared without offering them any further annoyance. The chief heard their story on their return, and spoke with great complacency of the art which he possessed of putting such things to right without any unpleasant bustle. The party were now on their road home, and the danger, though not the fatigue, of the expedition was at an end. They drove on the cattle with little repose until it was nearly dark, when Rob proposed to halt for the night upon a wide moor, across which a cold north-east wind, with frost on its wing, was whistling to the tune of the pipers of Strathdearn, the winds which sweep a wild glen in Badenoch are so called. The Highlanders, sheltered by their plaids, lay down on the heath quite comfortably enough, but the Lowlanders had no protection whatever. Rob Roy, observing this, directed one of his followers to afford the old man a portion of his plaid. "Brother Callant, the boy, he may," said the freebooter, "keep himself warm by walking about and watching the cattle." My informant heard this sentence with no small distress, and as the frost wind grew more and more cutting, it seemed to freeze the very blood in his young veins. He had been exposed to weather all his life, he said, but never could forget the cold of that night, insomuch that in the bitterness of his heart he cursed the bright moon for giving no heat with so much light. At length the sense of cold and weariness became so intolerable that he resolved to desert his watch to seek some repose and shelter. With that purpose he couched himself down behind one of the most bulky of the Highlanders, who acted as lieutenant to the party. Not satisfied with having secured the shelter of the man's large person, he coveted a share of his plaid, and by imperceptible degrees drew a corner of it round him. He was now comparatively in paradise, and slept sound till daybreak, when he awoke, and was terribly afraid on observing that his nocturnal operations had altogether uncovered the Duhinwassel's neck and shoulders, which, lacking the plaid which should have protected them, were covered with cranreuch, i.e. hoarfrost. The young lad rose in great dread of a beating, at least, when it should be found how luxuriously he had been accommodated at the expense of a principal person of the party. Good Mr. Lieutenant, however, got up and shook himself, rubbing off the hoarfrost with his plaid, and muttering something of a cauld nicht. They then drove on the cattle, which were restored to their owner without further adventure. The above can hardly be termed a tale, but yet it contains materials both for the poet and the artist. It was perhaps about the same time that, by a rapid march into the Balquhidder hills at the head of a body of his own tenantry, the Duke of Montrose actually surprised Rob Roy and made him prisoner. He was mounted behind one of the Duke's followers, named James Stewart, and made fast to him by a horse girth. The person who had him thus in charge was grandfather of the intelligent man of the same name, now deceased, who lately kept the inn in the vicinity of Loch Katrine, and acted as a guide to visitors through that beautiful scenery. From him I learned the story many years before. He was either a publican or a guide, except to moorfowl shooters. It was evening, to resume the story, and the Duke was pressing on to lodge his prisoner, so long sought after in vain, in some place of security, when, in crossing the Teeth or Forth, I forget which, MacGregor took an opportunity to conjure Stewart, by all the ties of old acquaintance and good neighbourhood, to give him some chance of an escape from an assured doom. Stewart was moved with compassion, perhaps with fear. He slipped the girth buckle, and Rob, dropping down from behind the horse's crop, dived, swam, and escaped, pretty much as described in the novel. When James Stewart came on shore, the Duke hastily demanded where his prisoner was, and, as no distinct answer was returned, instantly suspected Stewart's connivance at the escape of the outlaw, and, drawing a steel pistol from his belt, struck him down with a blow on the head, from the effects of which his descendants said he never completely recovered. In the success of his repeated escapes from the pursuit of his powerful enemy, Rob Roy at length became a wanton and facetious. He wrote a mock challenge to the Duke, which he circulated among his friends to amuse them over a bottle. The reader will find this document in the appendix, appendix number 3. It is written in a good hand, and not particularly deficient in grammar or spelling. Our southern readers must be given to understand that it was a piece of humour, a quiz, in short, on the part of the outlaw, who was too sagacious to propose such a rencontre in reality. This letter was written in the year 1719. In the following year Rob Roy composed another epistle very little to his own reputation, as he therein confesses having played booty during the Civil War of 1715. It is addressed to General Wade, at that time engaged in disarming the Highland clans, and making military roads through the country. The letter is a singular composition. It sets out the writer's real and unfeigned desire to have offered his service to King George, but for his liability to be thrown into jail for a civil debt at the instance of the Duke of Montrose. Being thus debarred from taking the right side, he acknowledged he embraced the wrong one, upon Falstaff's principle, that since the king wanted men and the rebels soldiers, it were worse shame to be idle in such a stirring world than to embrace the worst side, where it as black as rebellion could make it. The impossibility of his being neutral in such a debate Rob seems to lay down as an undeniable proposition. At the same time, while he acknowledges having been forced into an unnatural rebellion against King George, he pleads that he not only avoided acting offensively against his Majesty's forces on all occasions, but, on the contrary, sent to them what intelligence he could collect from time to time, for the truth of which he refers to his Grace the Duke of Argyle. What influence this plea had on General Wade we have no means of knowing. Rob Roy appears to have continued to live very much as usual. His fame in the meanwhile passed beyond the narrow limits of the country in which he resided. A pretended history of him appeared in London during his lifetime, under the title of the Highland Rogue. It is a catchpenny publication, bearing in front the effigy of a species of ogre, with a beard of a foot in length, and his actions are as much exaggerated as his personal appearance. Some few of the best known adventures of the hero are told, though with little accuracy, but the greater part of the pamphlet is entirely fictitious. It is a great pity so excellent a theme for a narrative of the kind had not fallen into the hands of Defoe, who was engaged at the time on subjects somewhat similar, though inferior in dignity and interest. As Rob Roy advanced in years, he became more peaceable in his habits, and his nephew, Glen, with most of his tribe, renounced those peculiar quarrels with the Duke of Montrose by which his uncle had been distinguished. The policy of that great family had latterly been rather to attach this wild tribe by kindness than to follow the mode of violence which had been hitherto ineffectually resorted to. Leases at a low rent were granted to many of the MacGregors, who had heretofore held possessions in the Duke's Highland property merely by occupancy, and Glengyle, or Blackney, who continued to act as collector of blackmail, managed his police, as a commander of the Highland watch arrayed at the charge of government. He is said to have strictly abstained from the open and lawless depredations which his kinsman had practised. It was probably after this state of temporary quiet had been obtained that Rob Roy began to think of the concerns of his future state. He had been bred and long professed himself a Protestant, but in his later years he embraced the Roman Catholic faith, perhaps on Mrs. Cole's principle that it was a comfortable religion for one of his calling. He is said to have alleged as the cause of his conversion a desire to gratify the noble family of Perth, who were then strict Catholics. Having, as he observed, assumed the name of the Duke of Argyle, his first protector, he could pay no compliment worth the Earl of Perth's acceptance, save complying with his mode of religion. Rob did not pretend, when pressed closely on the subject, to justify all the tenets of Catholicism, and acknowledged that extreme unction always appeared to him a great waste of ulzie, or oil. Such an admission is ascribed to the robber Donald Bean Lean in Waverley, chapter 22. In the last years of Rob Roy's life, his clan was involved in a dispute with one more powerful than themselves. Stewart of Appin, a chief of the tribe so named, was proprietor of a hill farm in the braes of Balquhidder, called Invernenty. The MacGregors of Rob Roy's tribe claimed a right to it by ancient occupancy, and declared they would oppose to the uttermost the settlement of any person upon the farm not being of their own name. The Stewarts came down with 200 men, well armed, to do themselves justice by main force. The MacGregors took to the field, but were unable to muster an equal strength. Rob Roy, fending himself the weaker party, asked a parley, in which he represented that both clans were friends to the king, and that he was unwilling that they should be weakened by mutual conflict, and thus made a merit of surrendering to Appin the disputed territory of Invernenty. Appin accordingly settled as tenants there at an easy quit rent. The MacLarens, a family dependent on the Stewarts, and from whose character of strength and bravery it was expected that they would make their right good if annoyed by the MacGregors. When all this had been amicably adjusted, in the presence of the two clans, drawn up in arms near the kirk of Balquhidder, Rob Roy, apparently fearing his tribe might be thought to have conceded too much upon the occasion, stepped forward and said that, where so many gallant men were met in arms, it would be shameful to part without a trial of skill, and therefore he took the freedom to invite any gentleman of the Stewarts present to exchange a few blows with him for the honour of their respective clans. The brother-in-law of Appin and second chieftain of the clan, Alastair Stewart of Inverness, accepted the challenge, and they encountered with broadsword and target before their respective kinsmen. Some accounts state that Appin himself was Rob Roy's antagonist on this occasion. My recollection from the account of Inverness himself was as stated in the text, but the period when I received the information is now so distant that it is possible I may be mistaken. Inverness was rather of low stature, but very well made, athletic, and an excellent swordsman. The combat lasted till Rob received a slight wound in the arm, which was the usual termination of such a combat when fought for honour only, and not with a mortal purpose. Rob Roy dropped his point and congratulated his adversary on having been the first man who ever drew blood from him. The victor generously acknowledged that without the advantage of youth and the agility accompanying it, he probably could not have come off with advantage. This was probably one of Rob Roy's last exploits in arms. The time of his death is not known with certainty, but he is generally said to have survived 1738, and to have died an aged man. When he found himself approaching his final change, he expressed some contrition for particular parts of his life. His wife laughed at these scruples of conscience, and exhorted him to die like a man, as he had lived. In reply, he rebuked her for her violent passions, and the counsels she had given him. "You have put strife," he said, "betwixt me and the best men of the country, and now you would place enmity between me and my God." There is a tradition, no way inconsistent with the former, if the character of Rob Roy be justly considered, that while on his deathbed he learned that a person with whom he was at enmity proposed to visit him. "Raise me from my bed," said the invalid, "throw me plaid round me, and bring me my claymore, dirk, and pistols. It shall never be said that a foeman said Rob Roy MacGregor defenceless and unarmed." His foeman, conjectured to be one of the MacLarens before and after mentioned, entered and paid his compliments, inquiring after the health of his formidable neighbour. Rob Roy maintained a cold, haughty civility during their short conference, and so soon as he had left the house, "Now," he said, "all is over. Let the piper play. Ha till me tullach." We return no more, and he is said to have expired before the dirge was finished. This singular man died in bed in his own house in the parish of Balquhidder. He was buried in the churchyard of the same parish, where his tombstone is only distinguished by a rude attempt at the figure of a broadsword. The character of Rob Roy is, of course, a mixed one. His sagacity, boldness, and prudence, qualities so highly necessary to success in war, became in some degree vices from the manner in which they were employed. The circumstances of his education, however, must be admitted as some extenuation of his habitual transgressions against the law, and for his political tergiversations he might in that distracted period plead that example of men far more powerful and less excusable in becoming the sport of circumstances than the poor and desperate outlaw. On the other hand, he was in the constant exercise of virtues, the more meritorious as they seem inconsistent with his general character. Pursuing the occupation of a predatory chieftain, in modern phrase a captain of banditti, Rob Roy was moderate in his revenge and humane in his successes. No charge of cruelty or bloodshed, unless in battle, is brought against his memory. In like manner, the formidable outlaw was the friend of the poor, and, to the utmost of his ability, the support of the widow and the orphan, kept his word when pledged, and died lamented in his own wild country, where there were hearts grateful for his beneficence, though their minds were not sufficiently instructed to appreciate his errors. The author perhaps ought to stop here, but the fate of a part of Rob Roy's family is so extraordinary as to call for a continuation of this somewhat prolix account, as affording an interesting chapter, not on Highland manners alone, but on every stage of society in which the people of a primitive and half civilized tribe are brought into close contact with a nation in which civilization and polity have attained a complete superiority. Rob had 5 sons: Coll, Ronald, James, Duncan, and Robert. Nothing occurs worth notice concerning 3 of them, but James, who was a very handsome man, seemed to have had a good deal of his father's spirit, and the mantle of Dougal Ciar Mhor had apparently descended on the shoulders of Robin Oig, that is, young Robin. Shortly after Rob Roy's death, the ill will which the MacGregors entertained against the MacLarens again broke out, at the instigation, it was said, of Rob's widow, who seems thus far to have deserved the character given to her by her husband, as an ate, stirring up to blood and strife. Robin Oig, under her instigation, swore that as soon as he could get back a certain gun which had belonged to his father, and had been lately at Doune to be repaired, he would shoot MacLaren for having presumed to settle on his mother's land. This fatal piece was taken from Robin Oig when he was seized many years afterwards. It remains in possession of the magistrates before whom he was brought for examination, and now makes part of a small collection of arms belonging to the author. It was a Spanish barrelled gun, marked with the letters R.M.C. for Robert MacGregor Campbell. He was as good as his word, and shot MacLaren when between the stilts of his plough, wounding him mortally. The aid of a Highland leech was procured, who probed the wound with a probe made out of a castock, i.e. the stalk of a colewort or cabbage. This learned gentleman declared he would not venture to prescribe, not knowing with what shot the patient had been wounded. MacLaren died, and about the same time his cattle were houghed and his livestock destroyed in a barbarous manner. Robin Oig, after this feat, which one of his biographers represents as the unhappy discharge of a gun, retired to his mother's house, to boast that he had drawn the first blood in the quarrel aforesaid. On the approach of troops and a body of the Stewarts, who were bound to take up the cause of their tenant, Robin Oig absconded and escaped all search. The doctor already mentioned, by name of Callum MacInleister, with James and Ronald, brothers to the actual perpetrator of the murder, were brought to trial. But as they contrived to represent the action as a rash deed committed by the daft callant Rob, to which they were not accessory, the jury found their accession to the crime was not proven. The alleged acts of spoil and violence on the MacLarens' cattle were also found to be unsupported by evidence. As it was proved, however, that the 2 brothers, Ronald and James, were held and reputed thieves, they were appointed to find caution to the extent of £200 for their good behaviour for 7 years. Note D. Author's expedition against the MacLarens. The spirit of clanship was at that time so strong, to which must be added the wish to secure the adherence of stout, able-bodied, and, as the Scotch phrase then went, pretty men, that the representative of the noble family of Perth condescended to act openly as patron of the MacGregors, and appeared as such upon their trial. So at least the author was informed by the late Robert M'Intosh, Esquire, advocate. The circumstances may, however, have occurred later than 1736, the year in which this first trial took place. Robin Oig served for a time in the 42nd Regiment, and was present at the Battle of Fontenoy, where he was made prisoner and wounded. He was exchanged, returned to Scotland, and obtained his discharge. He afterwards appeared openly in the MacGregors' country, and, notwithstanding his outlawry, married a daughter of Graham of Drunkey, a gentleman of some property. His wife died a few years afterwards. The insurrection of 1745, soon afterwards, called the MacGregors to arms. Robert MacGregor of Glencarnock, generally regarded as the chief of the whole name, and grandfather of Sir John, whom the clan received in that character, raised a MacGregor regiment, with which he joined the standard of the Chevalier. The race of Ciar Mhor, however, affecting independence, and commanded by Glen and his cousin James Roy MacGregor, did not join this kindred corps, but united themselves to the levies of the titular Duke of Perth, until William MacGregor Drummond of Bolhaldie, whom they regarded as head of their branch of Clan Alpine, should come over from France. To cement the union after the Highland fashion, James laid down the name of Campbell, and assumed that of Drummond, in compliment to Lord Perth. He was also called James Roy, after his father, and James Moor, or Big James, from his height. His corps, the relics of his father's Rob's band, behaved with great activity. With only 12 men he succeeded in surprising and burning, for the second time, the fort at Inversnaid, constructed for the express purpose of bridling the country of the MacGregors. What rank or command James MacGregor had is uncertain. He calls himself Major, and Chevalier Johnstone calls him Captain. He must have held rank under Glendu, his kinsman, but his active and audacious character placed him above the rest of his brethren. Many of his followers were unarmed. He supplied the want of guns and swords with scyblades set straight upon their handles. At the battle of Prestonpans, James Roy distinguished himself. "His company," said Chevalier Johnston, "did great execution with their scythes. They cut the legs of the horses in two, the rider through the middle of their bodies." MacGregor was brave and intrepid, but at the same time somewhat whimsical and singular. When advancing to the charge with his company, he received 5 wounds, 2 of them from balls that pierced his body through and through. Stretched on the ground, with his head resting on his hand, he called out loudly to the Highlanders of his company, "My lads, I am not dead, b'God. I shall see if any of you does not do his duty." The victory, as is well known, was instantly obtained. In some curious letters of James Roy, published in Blackwood's Magazine, Vol. 2, page 228, it appears that his thigh bone was broken on this occasion, and that he, nevertheless, rejoined the army with 6 companies, and was present at the battle of Culloden. After that defeat, the clan MacGregor kept together in a body, and did not disperse till they had returned into their own country. They brought James Roy with them in a litter, and without being particularly molested, he was permitted to reside in the MacGregors' country along with his brothers. James MacGregor Drummond was attainted for high treason with persons of more importance, but it appears he had entered into some communication with Government, as in the letters quoted he mentions having obtained a pass from the Lord Justice Clerk in 1747, which was a sufficient protection to him from the military. The circumstance is obscurely stated in one of the letters already quoted, but may perhaps, joined to subsequent incidents, authorize the suspicion that James, like his father, could look at both sides of the cards. As the confusion of the country subsided, the MacGregors, like foxes which had baffled the hounds, drew back to their old haunts, and lived unmolested. But an atrocious outrage, in which the sons of Rob Roy were concerned, brought at length on the family the full vengeance of the law. James Roy was a married man, and had 14 children, but his brother, Robin Oig, was now a widower, and it was resolved, if possible, that he should make his fortune by carrying off and marrying, by force if necessary, some woman of fortune from the lowlands. The imagination of the half-civilized Highlanders was less shocked at the idea of this particular species of violence than might be expected from their general kindness to the weaker sex when they make part of their own families. But all their views were tinged with the idea that they lived in a state of war, and in such a state, from the time of the siege of Troy to the moment when Perviza fell, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, Canto 2, the wealthy are slaughtered, the lovely are spared. The female captives are, to uncivilized victors, the most valuable part of the booty. We need not refer to the rape of Sabines, or to a similar instance in the Book of Judges, for evidence that such deeds of violence have been committed upon a large scale. Indeed, this sort of enterprise was so common among the Highland line as to give rise to a variety of songs and ballads. See Appendix No. 6. End of Rob Roy. Volume 1, Introduction, Part 4. Recording by Mike Harris.